Listen to the steel symphony of the urban landscape, a complex harmony of ambition, noise, and the silent dreams of millions. We bring you the stories that compose the music of our lives in stunning detail. Click subscribe now and tune into the heart of the city. I spent 31 years building things meant to last. Not just houses, not just buildings. I mean the kind of structures that outlive the people who commissioned them: courthouses, libraries, the kind of public works that still carry your name on a bronze plaque long after you're gone. I know how concrete behaves under pressure. I know which joints will hold and which ones are just decorative. I know that the most dangerous cracks are the ones you can't see from the outside, the ones hiding behind a fresh coat of paint and a well-rehearsed smile. I should have applied that knowledge to my own family years ago. My name is Robert. I'm 63 years old. I live alone now, in a house I designed myself, on a quiet street in Asheville, North Carolina, with a porch that faces the mountains and a kitchen that gets good light in the morning. I drink my coffee black. I take my medication at 7 a.m. I feed the neighbor's cat when she's out of town. It is, by any reasonable measure, a peaceful life. But 18 months ago, I was lying in a hospital bed in Orlando, Florida, with 3 blocked arteries and a phone that no one was answering, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat on a monitor and wondering how I had missed every single warning sign. Let me tell you how I got there. My wife, Carol, died 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. There is no gentle way to say that. One morning, she had a backache. 11 weeks later, I was standing in a cemetery in the rain holding a folded flag she never asked for and 2 adult children who were already arguing in low voices about the house. She was 58 years old. She had never smoked a day in her life. She made the best lemon pound cake you have ever tasted, and she laughed at her own jokes before she even finished telling them, and then she was gone. And the world just kept turning like nothing had happened. I did what men of my generation do. I worked. I threw myself into a municipal library project in Raleigh that consumed 14 months of my life. I called my son, Derek, every Sunday. I visited my daughter, Pamela, and her husband, Craig, in their house in Orlando, the house I had helped them buy with $140,000 of my own savings, because Craig's investment consulting business had not yet reached what Craig called full operational momentum, which, as far as I could tell, meant it had not yet made a single dollar. I want to be fair to Craig. He was not a monster. He was something more ordinary than that. He was a man who had figured out that being charming was easier than being competent, and he had built his entire adult life on that discovery. He had a firm handshake and good teeth, and he called me sir in a way that always sounded like a performance. My daughter loved him. That was the part I could never quite get around. Derek was different. Derek was 29, living in Atlanta, working for a marketing company with a name that sounded made up. He visited twice a year Christmas, and whatever weekend in summer was most convenient for him. He called me Dad the way people say noted in a work email. Technically responsive. Functionally empty. I am not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I made my choices. I kept writing the checks. I kept showing up. I told myself that family is complicated, that grief does strange things to people, that they would come around. I was a 62-year-old man with a graduate degree and 30 years of professional experience, and I was telling myself bedtime stories. The trip to Orlando was my idea. It was supposed to be a celebration. Pamela and Craig's 10th wedding anniversary. Derek flew in from Atlanta. I flew in from Asheville and paid for everyone's hotel 3 nights at a resort in Lake Buena Vista, the kind of place with a lazy river and a swim-up bar and enough cheerful signage to make you forget that everything costs 4 times what it should. I paid for the rooms. I paid for the welcome dinner on Thursday night. I paid for the anniversary dinner on Friday. I gave Pamela and Craig an envelope with $5,000 in it and told them to do something they'd always wanted to do. Craig shook my hand for a very long time. On Saturday afternoon, I wasn't feeling right. I want to be precise about this, because I have had people tell me it must have been obvious. It must have come on suddenly. Surely I knew. It was not like that. It was a heaviness in my chest, a tightness that spread into my left shoulder. the sense that someone was slowly tightening a belt around my ribcage from the inside. I had felt something similar a few months earlier, mentioned it to my GP, was told to watch my stress levels and come back in 6 weeks. I had the follow-up scheduled for the Tuesday after I got home. I sat down on the edge of the hotel bed and called Pamela. "Hey, Dad." She sounded distracted. I could hear music, voices, the specific ambient roar of a hotel pool. I told her I wasn't feeling well. I told her the chest tightness was back, worse than before. I told her I was a little scared. She said, "Do you think it's serious? Or is it just the heat? You know how the Florida heat gets to you." I said I didn't know. I said it felt different this time. She said, "Okay, well, drink some water and lie down. We're at the pool with Craig's cousins right now. They drove in from Tampa this morning. It would be really awkward for me to just leave. Text me in an hour and let me know how you're doing." I said okay. I drank some water. I lay down. 40 minutes later, I called the front desk and asked them to call an ambulance. I don't remember the ride to the hospital with any great clarity. I remember a paramedic named Luis, who had very calm hands and kept asking me to rate my pain on a scale of 1 to 10, and I kept saying 7, 8, 7, like I was negotiating. I remember the lights in the emergency bay. I remember someone cutting my shirt, a good linen shirt I had bought in Charleston 2 summers ago, and thinking, in the strange dissociated way you think about irrelevant things when your body is in crisis, that I hoped they'd at least gotten it at the collar seam. The cardiologist on call was a compact, efficient woman named Dr. Reyes. She told me I had 3 significantly blocked arteries. She told me I needed an emergency catheterization procedure, possibly followed by bypass surgery depending on what they found. She told me to call my family. A nurse named Deborah, a large, kind woman with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, offered to call them for me while they prepped me. I gave her the numbers. She stepped out into the hallway. I lay there watching the ceiling tiles. Deborah came back 10 minutes later. She had the careful, neutral expression of a person delivering information she wishes she did not have to deliver. "I reached your daughter," she said. "She said she'll check in with you in the morning." I looked at her. "She said you have her number if things get worse," Deborah said. And she said, she stopped. She looked down at her clipboard. "She said to tell you she's sorry for the timing. I want to be very clear about what happened next, because this is the part people find hardest to believe. And I understand that. And I also need you to understand that I am not exaggerating or dramatizing for effect. This is exactly what happened." Deborah, who owed me nothing, who had known me for approximately 20 minutes, pulled a chair up next to my bed, sat down, and held my hand while they waited for the catheterization suite to open up. She had 3 other patients. She came back between them. She did not have to do that. She did it anyway. My daughter went to dinner. I found out later, much later, that she had turned to Craig after hanging up the phone and said, "Dad's at the hospital. He says it might be his heart." And Craig had said, "Is it serious?" And Pamela had said, "I don't know. He's so dramatic sometimes." And they had ordered the mahi-mahi and the Chilean sea bass and a bottle of Sonoma Pinot Noir that cost $90. And they had stayed at that restaurant for 3 hours. I found out later, because a private investigator I had hired, more on that in a moment, had documented a conversation that took place at that table, overheard by a server who later provided a statement. I know how that sounds. I know. I found out that Derek had been informed by Pamela via text at 7:14 p.m. His reply, documented on his phone records, came at 7:52 p.m. It said, "Dang. Keep me posted." He did not call the hospital. He did not call me. He did not fly to Orlando. He watched a movie on his hotel room television and ordered room service at 10 o'clock. The procedure went well, technically speaking. 2 stents, no bypass required. Dr. Reyes told me the next morning that I had been, in her words, closer to the edge than I would like my patients to be before they come in. She told me to consider myself lucky. I lay in that hospital bed for 2 days. My daughter visited on Sunday afternoon, approximately 41 hours after I had been admitted. She brought flowers, grocery store flowers, the kind with the plastic sleeves still on them, and she sat in the chair next to my bed, and she told me she had been so worried, she hadn't slept. She felt terrible about the whole thing. I looked at her. I thought about 30 years of school plays and science fairs and SAT prep tutors. I thought about $140,000. I thought about a $90 bottle of wine. I said, "It's okay, honey. I'm just glad you're here." I smiled. And while I was smiling, something shifted inside me, and not in a medical sense. It was the feeling of a decision being made, not emotionally, not in anger, but in the cold, clear, architectural part of my brain that knows the difference between a structure that can be saved and one that needs to come down. I had retained a private investigator named Marcus 8 months before the Orlando trip. I want to explain why. Because it matters. It was not paranoia. It was not bitterness. It was a series of small things that had accumulated until I could no longer ignore them. Checks that cleared before I had confirmed they should. A conversation I overheard between Pamela and Craig, where Craig referred to when Robert finally decides to retire somewhere smaller in the future tense, as though my life were a logistical inconvenience currently blocking an inheritance. A discrepancy in the accounting of a small business loan I had guaranteed for Derek's consulting side project, $22,000, that had quietly disappeared into what Derek described as operating costs without a blank, single receipt. Marcus was thorough and discreet. He spent 8 months documenting things I had suspected and finding things I hadn't. By the time I was lying in that Orlando hospital bed, I already knew most of what there was to know. The hospitalization simply clarified what I needed to do about it. Here is what Marcus had found. Craig had been using the corporate credit card for his consulting firm, the firm I had helped capitalize for personal expenses for at least 3 years. Restaurants, hotels, clothing, a golf club membership, a weekend in Miami that had nothing to do with any client I could identify. The total, across 3 years, was $112,000. He had been running it through as business expenses. He had a bookkeeper who either didn't notice or didn't care. Derek had borrowed, across 4 separate transactions, disguised as family loans, a total of $67,000, none of which had any written agreement attached, and none of which had been repaid. He had told me, separately, that he was in a good place financially and was finally getting traction. He had said this at Christmas while wearing a watch that retailed for $4,000. I lay in that hospital bed, and I did the math. Between the house down payment, the business capitalization, the loans, and the personal expenses Craig had run through the company I had guaranteed, my family had received, taken, or stolen approximately $400,000 from me in 5 years. $400,000 that I had earned over 30 years of work, that I had saved carefully, that I had intended in some vague, optimistic, never quite articulated way to use for the last chapter of my own life. My daughter had brought me grocery store flowers. My son had sent a text that said, "Dang, I was discharged on Monday morning." Derek had already flown back to Atlanta. Pamela drove me to the airport and hugged me at the security line and said, "Take care of yourself, Dad. We worry about you." I told her I would. I meant it. On the plane home, I called my attorney. His name is Gerald, and I have known him for 22 years. And he is one of those men who communicates entirely in understatement. When I told him what I needed, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "That's quite a project." I said, "I know." He said, "Are you sure?" I said, "Gerald, 3 days ago I was alone in an emergency room while my family ate dinner." "Yes, I'm sure." He said, "Give me 2 weeks." Over the following 6 weeks, with Gerald's guidance and Marcus's documentation, I did what I should have done years earlier. I restructured everything. The personal guarantee on Craig's business loan was withdrawn, triggering a formal demand letter from the bank and an audit of the company's accounts. When the audit came back, the $112,000 in personal expenses on the corporate card became a matter of record. Craig hired a lawyer. The lawyer read the documentation Marcus had compiled. Craig's lawyer called Gerald and asked what I wanted. Gerald said I wanted full restitution and a formal dissolution of any financial relationship between my family and myself, documented and notarized. Craig's lawyer called back 2 days later and said his client would cooperate. The $67,000 Derek owed was converted retroactively and with Gerald's assistance into a formal debt instrument with a repayment schedule and interest. I sent Derek a registered letter explaining this. He called me, furious, and told me this was a betrayal of trust, that family doesn't do this to family, that I was being vindictive and cruel. I listened to the whole thing. When he was finished, I said, "Derek, I had a heart attack. You sent me a text at 7:52 p.m. and ordered room service. The debt stands." I hung up. I sold the investment property in Charlotte that both of my children had assumed would eventually come to them. I sold it quietly, to a developer I knew, at a fair price, and I moved the proceeds into an account structured in a way that Gerald described as inaccessible to your current situation. I updated my estate documents entirely. I will not detail the specifics, but I will say that a hospice in Western North Carolina and a scholarship fund at my alma mater became significantly better resourced that month. And then I did the thing that they did not expect. I stopped being available. Not dramatically, not all at once. I didn't write a letter, or deliver a speech, or send an email with a subject line designed to wound. I simply became, gradually and then completely, a person who was no longer reachable in the ways that had made me useful. The Sunday calls with Derek stopped, because I stopped answering on Sunday, and I stopped calling to reschedule. The monthly deposit I had been making into a joint account I shared with Pamela for household emergencies simply did not appear in October. And when she called to ask about it, I let it go to voicemail, and I listened to the message, her voice confused, and then impatient, and then cycling back to something almost plaintive, and I deleted it. I was not angry. That is the thing I want you to understand. The anger had been there. Certainly, in those first days in the hospital. But by the time I was executing this plan, what I felt was something closer to the professional calm I feel when I'm walking away from a building that cannot be saved. A kind of sad clarity. A recognition that love and obligation are not the same thing, and that I had spent a decade confusing the two at tremendous personal cost. It was November when everything finally broke into the open. Craig's audit had progressed to a point where the bank brought in an outside investigator, and the outside investigator found things even Marcus had not found specifically. A series of transactions that crossed from civil misconduct into territory that interested law enforcement. I will not describe the details here. I will only say that when I received a call from a detective in Orange County, Florida, telling me that my son-in-law had been arrested and asking if I wished to provide a statement, I said yes. I drove back to Orlando in December, not at anyone's request, but because I wanted to be present when it concluded. The hearing was on a Thursday morning. I sat in the third row. Pamela was there, 2 rows ahead of me, and she did not see me come in. She was wearing a gray coat, and her hair was different than I remembered, and she looked, from the back, younger and more frightened than I had seen her in years. I felt something watching her, not contempt, not satisfaction, something more complicated and more honest than either of those things, something that felt like grief. Craig was led in by a bailiff. He did not look my direction. His lawyer was very good, and the proceedings were technical and moved quickly. And when it was over, he was remanded pending a formal sentencing. As the bailiff let him out, Craig turned once and looked at the gallery. His eyes found me, before they found my daughter. I held his gaze for exactly as long as I chose to. And then I looked away first, not in defeat, but because I had already decided he was no longer worth the real estate. Pamela saw me as the room cleared. She came across the row of seats and stopped a few feet away and looked at me like she was trying to remember how something worked. "Dad," she said, "why didn't you tell me you were coming?" I said, "I wasn't sure I was going to come." She said, Are you okay?" I said, "I'm much better, actually. My cardiologist says my numbers look good." She said, I meant about all of this." She made a gesture that was supposed to encompass Craig, the courtroom, the preceding 6 months. I mean, you pressed charges. I said. I provided a statement. She started to say something else and then stopped. A long moment passed between us. The kind of moment that contains many smaller moments, years of them. Finally, she said, I didn't know it was this bad. With Craig and the money, I want you to know I didn't know. I looked at her for a while. My daughter. 41 hours. Grocery store flowers. I said, I know you didn't. Whether that was true, I'm still deciding. I drove back to Asheville that afternoon. The mountains were doing what they do in December, that particular shade of steel blue that the Western Carolina sky turns in winter, like a painting by someone who knows how to be restrained. I stopped for gas outside of Hendersonville and bought a cup of coffee from a machine that was not as bad as it should have been, and I stood in the parking lot for a few minutes just breathing cold air. And I thought, I am 63 years old, and I am still here, and the view from where I'm standing, all things considered, is not bad. Marcus, my private investigator, sent me a card at Christmas. Just a card. No message. A photo of a mountain sunrise. I put it on the mantel. Deborah, the nurse from the hospital, I sent flowers to. Real ones. I found the hospital's address and sent them to the nursing station with her name on the card. I don't know if she got them. I hope she did. Derek called me in January. He was calmer. He did not apologize directly. Derek has never apologized directly for anything in his life. It is not in his construction. But he said he had been thinking, and he said he knew the Orlando situation hadn't been handled well, and he said he missed talking. I said, I miss talking too. I told him about the repayment schedule and said it wasn't going anywhere, but that we could talk about a modified timeline if he wanted to have a real conversation. He said he'd think about it. He called again in February. We talked for 40 minutes. It was uncomfortable and halting and honest in a way that our conversations have not been in years, maybe ever. I don't know what happens next with my son. I know that I am no longer going to decide that for him by absorbing every consequence. Some things you build. Some things you renovate. Some things you walk away from. And let the land go back to what it was before you showed up. I know the difference now. The porch faces west, and in the evenings the light comes in at an angle that turns everything a kind of warm amber that Carol would have loved. I sit there most nights with my coffee, watching the mountains do their mountain thing. Unhurried and enormous, and completely indifferent to the small human dramas playing out at their feet. My numbers look good. My cardiologist said so. I am still here. That, it turns out, is enough.